Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Southern horrors and other writings. Today we're going to get into the book, into the actual book itself, and we're starting off with part one's the introduction, Equity and Justice for All. So, with that said, let's hop into this. Lynching and Reconstruction. 8 Negroes lynched since last issue of the Free Speech. One at Little Rock, Arkansas last Saturday morning, where the citizens broke into the penitentiary and got their man. 3 near Anniston, Alabama, 1 near New Orleans, and 3 at Clarksville, Georgia. The last 3 for killing a white man and 5 on the same old racket. The new alarm about raping white women. The same program of hanging, then shooting bullets into the lifeless bodies, was carried out to the letter. Nobody in this section believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men assaulted white women. If Southern white men are not careful, they will overreach themselves, and public sentiment will have a reaction. A conclusion will then be reached, which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. Ida Wells wrote this editorial on May the 21st, 1892. An African American woman who was co-owner, editor, reporter, and publisher of the Free Speech, a weekly newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee. Wells was what we might today have called an investigative journalist. Typically, she would identify a problem or issue, collect data that served to instruct and enlighten, and report the findings to her readers. She was known for stating her case simply and directly without mincing words. This editorial, however, which describes 8 incidents of lynching, has been incredibly bold even for an outspoken journalist because of what it suggested about the truth of lynching. Inspired by the data that she had been collecting for more than 2 months, Wells raised several very uncomfortable specters between the lines of this editorial. The unstated question was, if assaulting white women is a threadbare lie, then what might the truth be? In suggesting such a question, Wells permitted all sorts of codes of etiquette to be broken by alluding to relationships between black men and white women that in 1892 would have been unspeakable and certainly not spoken about in the newspaper by an African American woman. She hinted that the truth might be more obvious than the crafters of the threadbare lie were willing to acknowledge. More obvious, that is, if readers actually paid attention to the facts. The editorial invited the readers to do just that, to pay attention to the facts. As documented by Crusade for Justice, the autobiography of Ida B. Wells, Wells campaigned energetically for truth and justice throughout her life, with anti-lynching activities figuring prominently among the causes to which she gave her attention. The activities between May the 21st, 1892, when she wrote her provocative editorial, and September the 1st, 1900, when she signed the introduction to Mob Rule in New Orleans, her third pamphlet on lynching, however, marked the most intense portion other contributions to the anti-lynching movement. Wells chronicled a change in her understanding of lynching that began with the lynching of 3 friends. On the morning of March the 9th, 1892, the bodies of Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart were found shot to pieces in a field a mile north of Memphis, Tennessee, by hands unknown. The men had owned and operated the People's Grocery Store, a store in competition with a grocery owned and operated by a white man. The stores were located across the street from each other in an area known in Memphis as the Curve, an area that was beyond the Memphis city limits, beyond police protection. A few days before, an altercation instigated by the white store owner had resulted in a late-night shootout at the People's Grocery and the wounding of 3 white men. In the wake of the shootout, numbers of African American men were randomly arrested. Guns were confiscated throughout the African American community, and the 3 business partners were jailed and charged with wounding white men, despite their doing so in what they had thought was the defense of their property. By law, the wounding of a white person, as compared with the killing of a white person, was not punishable by death. Nonetheless, on March the 9th, lynch law prevailed, and between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, the white men who were not yet convicted by law were removed from their jail cells, put in a railroad car, carried north of the city, and shot to death. Word came to Wells about the lynching while she was in Natchez, Mississippi on one of her many trips to co-owner, editor, and reporter for the Free Speech. Thomas Moss and his family were Wells' closest friends. She was devastated by the news, but also incensed that such a thing could happen. Before this incident, Wells had abhorred lynching, but had accepted the idea that it was the horror of rape and other crimes that incited such violence. With this lynching, however, the lynching of men whom she knew to be leading citizens of Memphis, her eyes were opened to the truth. Lynching was not simply a spontaneous punishment for crimes, but an act of terror perpetrated against a race of people in order to maintain power and control. She began to see that these ritualized murders were acts of violence and intimidation designed to retard the progress of African Americans in their efforts to participate more fully in social, political, and economic life. As she explained in her autobiography, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Lee Stewart had been lynched in Memphis, one of the leading cities of the South in which no lynching had taken place before, with just as much brutality as other victims of the mob, and they had committed no crime against white women. This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was. An excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized and keep the nigger down. Wells' immediate response to the lynchings was to write editorials that encouraged African Americans in Memphis to leave a city that offered no protection of their rights of citizenship and go west to Kansas and Oklahoma. Her editorials were successful, affecting in a significant way the migration of thousands of African Americans to the West, Wells also began collecting data on other lynchings, and on May the 21st, 1892, she wrote the editorial quoted at the start of this introduction. Wells' actions were extraordinary for her time. To appreciate fully just how bold and courageous she was, we need to examine two sets of factors relative to the period in which she lived: the rise and fall of Reconstruction and the backdrop that it provided for mob violence against African Americans, and the emergence of a woman's era, a time during which women were questioning, redefining, and reshaping the woman's sphere. But that ends that piece. Now, before we really discuss this, I want to mention I do not like that word, the N word, but in these contextualizations, because the content, the subject itself is so vile. I'm talking about lynching and the treatment of a whole race of people simply for their skin color. I will say how things are written. Again, I do not like that word, the N word. But Wells had it written in quotations. So, again, the content, the subject is not an easy subject, but things must be shoved in the face sometimes of people, or they don't get it. With that said, yeah. Ida B. Wells, we start off with her, piece editorial she wrote. And how the people were treated. Hanging, shooting bullets into their corpses. Yeah. And usually it was, oh, black men will assault white women, which turns out was a bunch of BS. But yeah. 3 killed near Anniston, Alabama, 1 near New Orleans, and 3 at Clarksville, Georgia. But it's the 3 who would be hung on March the 9th in 1892. Well, that's when their bodies were found, but close enough. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart. She's got Lee Stewart, so it may be Will Lee Stewart. Something like that. But Moss apparently was real close friends. He and his family were real close friends to Ida. It just shows the vile, disgusting, inhuman treatment that was shown towards African Americans, people of color. Yeah. But I hope you stick with me while I read this. Like I said, this will be a bumpy ride. It's not a pleasant subject. So, yeah. But it's one that needs to be heard, needs to be known. You know, because people wanted to ignore such stuff is how we ended up in this dumb fuck situation we're in again. But, yeah. Anyway, as always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.